Hello, my name is Michael McLennan, and welcome to COVID Matters, the podcast produced by COVID Aid. In this episode, we're speaking to Dr. Dean Burnett. He's a neuroscientist, lecturer, author, blogger, podcaster, pundit, science communicator, comedian, and numerous other things. And most recently, he's written Psychological. In the book, he reveals what's actually going on in our brains when we suffer mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and addiction. I personally found it really useful to listen to over the past few months, so it was great to chat with Dean to find out more. I think it would be really helpful to find out a bit about Psychological and what was your motivation for writing it.
Yeah, the book Psychological, my most recent release, is essentially the science of mental health. It comes from a lot of different sort of strands in my general professional life. I never really saw myself as being a mental health writer. That was never my plan because, as I say in the book and elsewhere, and whenever anyone asks, I've never had a clinical problem with my mental health thus far. I mean, could happen, obviously. Came close to happening during the pandemic. I had a lot of traumas to deal with, but thus far I've never lost the ability to function. So I'm very much in the agreement with the sort of the general stance that the discussion around mental health problems should be led by those who have personal first-hand experience with them. Because I just think that it's such a subjective thing. It's such a variable thing that being objective and sort of, you're consistent with it is kind of impossible. So it should be those who know the most should tell us about it. And so that's my general, that's always been my general vibe. But when I started my writing career professionally, I was working as a psychiatry tutor and lecturer because I'm a doctor of neuroscience. I have a lot of experience with the brain and stuff. So I was writing about the brain anyway. And I worked with The Guardian. My general approach was, I thought I was a false modesty or anything, but I described myself as the jester of the science section because I was the guy who did comedy on the side as well. So I wrote like funny things about science or satirical stuff, and it went down well. Got a nice audience for it, but I never saw myself as a serious writer because I thought, well, that's not my niche. Other people do that better than me. And then, so I was just chugging along doing that. I was quite happy with it. There was some interest in me doing a book and talking about that. And then it was August 2015, or was it 14? I think it was 14. Robin Williams passed away, by suicide. And it was, the news had broken. I went to the office that morning and it was obviously on American time. So news had broke that Robin Williams had died of suicide, and everyone was heartbroken. It was horrible, and it was rolling coverage of his life and his legacy. But already, the news was only a few hours old, you're seeing by social media and the various media outlets, people saying it was selfish. He was a selfish man for taking his life like this, upsetting those who loved him and giving everything he's got. How would he do that? It's just selfish. And you got that a lot when someone high profile dies by suicide. It just seems to be a knee-jerk thing. For whatever reason it comes from, but that's not how it works. It's the other time I was lecturing in psychiatry and mental health and teaching people how to approach it, not from the medical standpoint, but from sort of the more holistic, taking patients' stories into account and looking from their perspective and all that sort of stuff. And I knew that firsthand by various experiences that's not how depression worked. And I knew the dangers that bad reporting of mental health can cause, because I'm from Bridgend, the South Wales area, which had the Bridgend suicide spate in the early 2000s. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but my family was deeply affected by that. Certain members were part of my extended family. And the media coverage of it was just shocking. It was like some sort of, this ghoulish town where these children are taking their own lives. What's that about? It was sensationalist. It was completely inconsiderate because, poor white Welsh working class values town, and what do we matter? Essentially, was the gist of it. We're just good for sensationalism and look at the weirdos sort of stuff. And that I don't know how much damage that did. I mean, how many lives were lost because that's sort of reported. So I've always had a bit of a knee-jerk resistance to bad reporting mental health stuff. So when the Robin Williams thing happened, I was seeing this, and it sort of just tipped me over the edge slightly. In that I thought, well, somebody should say in the media that that's not how it works. That's not how depression works. And we thought it was depression by he died at the time. Turns out it was Lewy body dementia, but that's a whole other thing. And there's a lot of overlap with that in dementia. But anyway, at the time, it was assumed he died because of depression. And I'm thinking, someone should correct this. Someone should put out, the actual explanation of how it works. And I think no one's ever going to do that. But then I realized I had this Guardian blog. It wasn't the biggest thing, it was a niche thing, but I could do something. And I did. Wrote this quick piece about like, that's how depression works. It works like this. It's not selfish. You stop saying that because it just does more damage. And I put it up there and I said to them, look, you can put this up. I know it's not going to get much traction because it's the day of Robin Williams stories, but I feel better with having said something. And it went up, and it was the most popular piece that week of any of the Robin Williams coverage, and we read like 2 or 3 million times in the first 7 days, and it sort of pushed my profile way beyond where it was currently at. And as a result, I sort of became something of a go-to guy for mental health coverage or mental health stories or commentary, because I approached it scientifically. It wasn't my personal experiences. It was like, well, this is what the facts say. Here's the psychiatric review, here's the psychological review. But it's important to keep these things in mind. You can't just have this assumption that that's how it works and ignore everything else. And I think it provided context and sort of insight, and it helped sort of reduce stigma by saying, no, this is why it happens. And I sort of wanted to do a book about that. Well, I felt a book about that would be helpful at some point, or in various ways. The first book I did wasn't about that, but there's elements of that in it, and same with the second and third. So it's always been something I've steered towards or tried to include. And when the opportunity came up with Audible, who said they wanted a dedicated audiobook, I said, well, I can do it about mental health. I've always wanted to do that. They said, that's great. And I did. And then Faber published it in a paperback earlier this year. So in a roundabout way, that's the various routes which culminated in me writing this book, which is why mental health goes wrong and why it happens in the brain like it does, and so on and so on. And people seem to like it so far, and I'm quite happy with that.
And part of what you talked about there is the fact that there has been stigma. And I can remember from 5, 10, 20 years ago, there seems to have been progress, but it seems that the lockdown, the pandemic, has really accelerated an understanding of the fact that we all have this concept of mental health that we are looking to try and maintain, but we've been thrust into a completely abnormal situation that none of us have experienced before. And I think that's part of what was really interesting listening to the audiobook as I did over the past couple of months. So can you tell me, I'm aware this can be hard, like you say in the audiobook, you're compressing so much information and things are changing all the time. But can you tell me a bit about the depression and anxiety and addictions, what some of the causes for those are?
Well, there does seem to be, according to all the literature I looked through, and I did go through a lot because I like to be thorough, because I'm very paranoid about being found out or being told I'm wrong about stuff. So it's going to happen anyway, but I like to have at least a base my claims on as much fact as possible. One of the main factors in the prevalence of mental health problems in the modern world is stress. And you'll see some the typical contrarians say like, well, modern world's so easy. Like I was tired an hour a day, and like during the war they had it hard, and blah, 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 blah. The usual contrarian nonsense. It doesn't work like that, though. I mean, stress is a subjective thing. If you are born into massive, massive wealth and you have never to worry about money ever, you have a high standard of living. But that becomes your baseline because that's what you're used to. So say like if your mansion burns down, you could afford loads more. You can afford another one next day. But the fact is you've lost something you cared about and it's all the stuff in it. That's going to cause you a lot of stress, and that could cause you to develop a mental health problem as a result. So, it's a subjective thing. So even though our lives are objectively more comfortable than the past now, there's still plenty more to be stressed about. The more you have, the more you can lose, I suppose you could argue that way. So stress is easy to come by, and our brains are very good at stress. They are sort of inherently predisposed via something called the threat detection network to look for dangers and risks and hazards, because that's kept us alive for millions upon millions of years before we were humans. It's a deeply embedded circuit in the brain. And when we encounter something which is a threat or could potentially harm us, we experience the fear response, or as people often call it, the fight or flight reaction. But it's not all or nothing. It's not like anything potentially dangerous, suddenly full fight or flight, because that's impractical. That it's a big, powerful and draining response when you have that full adrenaline shock. You just go into panic mode. You can't do that with everything which may possibly present some sort of risk at some point, because you never get anything done. So the precursors, or like the build up to the stress fight or flight response, that's what stress is essentially. It's your body becoming prepped to deal with a danger. It's like I think in the book I use the analogy that it's like if the fight or flight response is the big boss in a video game, stress is all the minions you have to wade through to get to it. Not they actively want to, but that's sort of, so they're not as big or powerful as the main thing, but there's a lot more of them, and they can easily damage you and kill you if you need to. They need to, and this is a sort of problem because the human brain sort of evolved in a way which has been just become a victim of its own success. It can now encapsulate and appreciate and just be aware of possibilities and hypothetical scenarios, or it can predict things, it can anticipate, which is a great boon when you do a lot of stuff with that. But because the fundamental parts of our brain, which handle stress and the various emotions, they don't really discern between things that are really happening to us and things that could potentially happen to us at some point that the higher brain sort of creates. So normally, a creature in the wild would be stressed by the presence of a predator or lack of food or wandering through new territory with lots of shadows. So these are all things which these could be threatening to us right now. These could present a mortal danger to us any minute. So you become stressed, just going through stuff like that. But with a human, with a human brain, you can think well, the economy is not going great because of the pandemic. I could lose my job. I could I could lose my income. I could not pay my mortgage. I could lose the house. And these things stress you out. They haven't happened. They may never happen, but the possibility of these hypothetical things happening causes us stress, even though they don't actually physically harm us, unless you count, not being able to buy food or shelter and stuff is harmful. Or if you're in a relationship, you see your partner talk to someone else and you don't know who that is. You think, oh, maybe she or he is flirting with them. Maybe she is planning to leave me. You bring up all these wild scenarios in your head about what could happen if your partner dumped you and broke up, and you become suspicious and stuff, and you have these emotional reactions to things which A, haven't happened, and B, may never happen. And we even become stressed about things which definitely did not and cannot happen. When you cross a road absentmindedly and a car nearly misses you, you'll be panicked about that for hours. You'll have the fear reaction. You'll dwell on it. You'll think about it constantly, because it's your brain's way of learning, sort of saying, right, that was bad. Don't do that again. Got to reinforce this over and over again until it sinks in that I don't want to be in that situation where I could be killed like that again. So there are loads of things the human brain is able to conjure up which causes stress. But the stress mechanism is still the same fundamental one we've had for millions of years. And the brain didn't really evolve to deal with stress long term. It's supposed to be like an acute stress, like the short, sharp burst of it, because danger is here. Either it gets you or you escape it, in which case danger is gone and you live to fight another day. So stress, or the fear response, is meant to be temporary. But because we can keep these possibilities in our head and there's no real getting rid of them. So if you're paranoid that your partner's going to leave you, until they actively do leave you, you're going to constantly be paranoid about that because you can't prove a negative. And so there's no end point to that. So you can be constantly stressed about that. Or if your job is hard and constantly demanding things of you and there's no end in sight, that'll constantly stress you out and there's no end point to it. But stress has a tangible physical effect on us. It causes us to become immunosuppressed. It suppresses the immune reaction, because when you're fighting for your life, you don't want to have sort of the swelling and inflammation of an immune response. So that's sort of maybe a short-term stopgap to keep us going, but it's not helpful in long-term at all. And it causes us to gain weight because we comfort eat or build up our reserves to ensure that we survive long-term because we're stressed and stuff. And we drink more just to take the edge off, and that's self-medicating and stuff. So these things make us unhealthier and we become more stressed as a result. But then these stress chemicals also have effects on the brain, like they amp up the focus and the memory system when we're stressed, and that it's an emotional response, and the brain adapts. It becomes it changes in response to what's asked of it, and that means the parts you use more often become bigger and stronger, like a muscle. So the amygdala, the part which controls stress and fear, becomes more active when we're constantly stressed because it's been used more, to the point where it's the usual systems to keep it in check and rein it in aren't powerful enough to stop it. And you experience constant fear and stress, which is anxiety. You have a constant unattached anxiety response. You're afraid and you don't know why. There's no real reason for it. Or if there is a reason, your fear response is completely disproportionate to what the actual outcome could be. Or it can happen in sort of short bursts because the amygdala just suddenly kicks off and you have panic attacks. So it's like that. Or there could be a certain one traumatic event, which is PTSD. So this lingers in your memory and causes this constant anxiety because you can't face it. You can't process it. It's just too traumatic. So that's sort of anxiety and how stress works there. But not every part of the brain adapts in the same way. And one modern theory is that constant stress causes the parts of the brain which control mood, regulate mood, allow it to change. They become overtaxed by stress. Like they sort of constantly react into it. They get worn out. The neurons are exhausted by the constant demands placed on them by the stress chemicals. So they just stop working. They don't die, but they're sort of on standby. And therefore our mood becomes fixed and we can't change it. And because we were stressed before, and it usually means it's a bad mood or a negative mood or just even no mood whatsoever. And that's sort of like the hallmark of depression. It's not being sad because, as people point out, everyone has low moods now and again. It's that you can't change them. Like they stay in place for 2 weeks at a time, which is really weird for any mood, let alone a really bad one, a really low one. And it's because the theory is now that these neurons, which allow us to change our mood, have been just worn out by stress. And antidepressants slowly but gradually coax them back into life, which is why antidepressants take 2 to 3 weeks to kick in, or at least the everyday antidepressants we most commonly subscribe, the SSRIs or the MOAs and stuff. So, yeah, so it's a lot to do with stress. Seems to be like the key aspect of a lot of modern day mental health problems, which is, and when it comes to addiction, not so much stress, but the response to stress. You sort of self-medicate, and if you're prone to addiction or your reward pathway is too sensitive, then you might be someone who's got a weakness for just becoming addicted to these pleasurable novel compounds, and your brain adapts to them in really unhelpful and harmful ways. So, you can point to stress as a big factor in a lot of modern day mental health stuff. And obviously, as you alluded to just now, the pandemic has caused a lot of people to be a lot more stressed for longer periods, combined with the fact that the usual avenues for reducing stress in healthier ways, like going out or just traveling or experiencing new things or just getting out and about or seeing friends and family, these are all known to be stress reducers. All of those have been sort of blocked. We can't do any of those things. So not only do we have a lot more to worry about the pandemic itself and all the restrictions we have to obey and the danger of it and the uncertainty of it all, and it's added to the stress, and our usual options for dispelling the stress have been taken away too. So it's like a double whammy of increased stress for a lot of people, which is why you'd expect to see sharp spikes in the general mental health problems of the overall population. And going by the data available now, we are actually seeing that. So, yeah, so it's all some sort of constant theme of stress and anxiety and dealing with the issues of modern life, which takes its toll on our mental health.
And thinking about because there's been that combination that people have experienced a variety of whether it's anxiety, depression, lapses into addiction or journeys into that, as well as I know there's been people talk about languishing as well. And has there been anything that surprised you in terms of how we as a public have dealt with such a unique situation over the past year and few months?
Yeah, it's been a lot of surprises, both good and bad, obviously. I mean, it's been quite surprising how many people have just not accepted it, just refused to believe that it's even a thing. And I'm sort of surprised, but not really surprised when I think about it, with the level of conspiracy theories which pop up about it, and think like, so it must be a hoax, it must be it's a scam, or it's a lie, or it's a cover up, all these things. It does actually make sense when you think that it's a big, scary event that's happened in the wider world. It's affected all of us in some way, shape, or form. Some more than others, definitely. But everyone's been, tangibly affected by this thing that's happened. And conspiracy theories arise when you think that the human brain instinctively does not like uncertainty, because uncertainty means you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't prepare for it or can't anticipate it. So it could hurt you, and that's not a good way to be. And so, look, the human brain does whatever it can to reduce uncertainty. And in stuff like this, or like major world events which are bad, the idea that they can happen just randomly by just pure bad luck is, for me, in a fundamental way, scarier than the idea that they were organized by a shadowy cabal or like the Illuminati or whatever it happens to be, because that means, we can't do anything about it. If it's chance or bad luck, that's just the way the dice fall sometimes. But if it's, it's all the work of the mysterious powers, then somebody's in charge here at least. We can appeal to the better nature, we can find them out, and it also gives you a sense of superiority, a sense of strength, sense of reassurance that I know the secret, nobody else does. I know it. I'm better than you because it's a sense of control which we all sort of strive for in everyday situations. So there's been that. I have been sort of pleased by the degree to which most people have been quite willing to go along with the restrictions and stuff, as much as they don't like it. That was one thing the government behavioral scientists underestimated. I've always been, by and large, I'm an optimist about people. I think the average person is a good person. Maybe they define good different to I do, but they mean well and will do the right thing in most situations. Some don't. They stand out and they tend to be elected, and that's that's a whole other issue. But it's, so I'm an optimist. So that was reassuring for me to see that lots of people will do what's required. I know there's lots of news about people who don't, like people who sort of break curfew, break lockdown rules and storm the beaches and stuff. But when you think of how many people there are in this country, there's still a surprisingly small percentage of us all. But because they're the ones doing stuff, then they get the news coverage. So, there's no news to be had in 99.9% of people just behave normally. And that's not a news story. It's 10,000 people are bad versus 57 million people are fine. But it's the former which actually gets headlines. So, that wasn't a surprise, but it's, if you look at it like that way, I think it can be quite reassuring. So, yeah, it's been a mixed bag of experiences during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I was going to ask in terms of your own brain, because as somebody who studies it, I wondered if there's anything about your own reaction and your own experience which has surprised you since the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm literally writing a book about that exact thing right now. It'll hopefully be out next year if I can hit the deadline by the end of this month. But it's because I've had a particularly tough pandemic. As people who know me will know that April last year, my father passed away from COVID. He contracted in March and lasted a month and succumbed to it. And he's 58 years old, no prior health conditions. So it was a very painful, tragic loss for me in the midst of the strongest possible lockdown, where I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't be with anyone. I couldn't have anyone help me or share my grief, or when people experience severe grief, you help out, didn't you? Go around, you look after their kids for them, you cook for them, or you just do what you can do. And I couldn't have any of that. I had to still be the father to my children they needed, because they were scared and alone and isolated in this particularly traumatic time. So I guess I was sort of surprised by how I managed to get through it. My mental health took a huge knock. I'm not arguing that. My well-being really suffered, but never declined to the point where I couldn't cope or couldn't function. But who knows? Maybe it will. Because like I say, one thing I do know is that we're only just now coming out of lockdown-ish. And I haven't been back in the normal world since my father died. So should I end up sort of seeing family more regularly again and doing things which I would be doing, which he would normally be at finally, maybe his absence will then suddenly strike me as, oh my God, he's gone. He's never coming back, because I haven't seen him for a year and a half now nearly. But I haven't seen barely anyone. And that's sort of, it's not different enough for me to appreciate it in a tangible sense. But it's been helpful being a neuroscience guy at this time, like knowing why my reactions are what they are. But I've also learned a great deal about just how entrenched or set up emotions. Like it's quite typical in science to not ignore emotions, but sort of put them to one side, or just they're fine, they're just there. And that that's what the thrust of the book is, like my emotional reactions. The book's going to be called Emotional Ignorance. It's meant to be called emotional intelligence. Then I realized I don't have any, so I had to call it emotional ignorance, and hopefully that'll resonate. Because but it's despite being the go-to brain expert for many years now, the depth of my own ignorance about how my own brain dealt with emotions was quite startling to me. And I've the range of things I felt. The whole thing about 5 stages of grief, it's nowhere near that simple. Even the person who originated that says it's not that simple. It's just been warped by the mainstream. But so it's been helpful to grasp out this is happening. I sort of get why this is happening, but being unable to do anything about it is perhaps the most profound thing. Like my father's funeral, I didn't cry until later that evening, apart from a few moments. And I wanted to. I actively felt like I should. I was certainly sad enough. It was horrible, but I didn't because there was other people around, and I'd been conditioned my entire life, not by anyone on purpose, but I'm the man. I don't cry. I'm strong. I am stoic, and I know how harmful that stereotype is. I know how harmful that cliche, because emotional suppression is never more than just a short-term helpful thing. If you're trying to get through something, in the long term, it's really damaging. It stops you processing your emotions, it lets them build up, it affects your memory, it affects your well-being, and it may be a big factor in why male suicide is so much higher than female suicide, because we don't have the ability to cope with our emotions because we're never allowed or never encouraged to express them, which is a big part of how we deal with and process our emotions. And I've learned that since, but knowing that and being able to do it was a whole other thing. And that was weird for me to find out, well, as much as I know this is just a cultural stereotype that men aren't emotional, men don't show emotions, as much as I wanted to break it, it was still really hard to do so because that stuff goes in very, very deep. So to sum up my general view of how being a neuroscientist helped me through my pandemic, it's sort of like being a trained mechanic trapped in a car with no brakes on the motorway. You know what the problem is, but you're still inside it. You can't do anything about it until this comes to a stop. You just got to grab the wheel and hope you can get through this and hope nothing sideswipes you or totals you until you can get to a safe place. And just knowing what the problem is one thing, but being able to address it, I couldn't, because it is all happening. This is the brain I was using to think about this was the brain that was throwing out all these disruptive feelings and emotions. So it was an interesting experience, but one everyone can read about soon enough, I guess.
Finally, in terms of advice for people listening to this, I think one of the things you speak about in the book is the fact that through understanding how the brain works, and that can help in terms of being able to cope with it. Would that be correct?
Yeah. I mean, one thing which seems to be a common theme in a lot of modern therapies, particularly those based on developments in technology, is that it involves the process of taking the aspects of the mental health problem and making them more tangible, giving them sort of presence in the real world, which they otherwise lack, because that is something mental health problems often don't have compared to physical problems. Because with a physical health problem like a broken leg, you can point to it and say, that's my leg, that's what's wrong with it, and it's not really me. But with low moods or constant anxiety or hallucinations or paranoia, it's happening within your own mind. No one else can see it, and your experience of it is really intimate, and it's kind of hard to express it or to get any sort of grasp on it because there's no boundaries to it. It's your mind is intangible, it's subjective, there's no limit or definition to it. That makes anything that goes wrong with it a lot more scary, or I think this sort of stuff fuels the stigma and suspicion around it. So a lot of modern technology is being introduced to give mental health problems more of a presence. The things called like biofeedback and neurofeedback, where someone with anxiety is hooked up to a monitor and shown their sort of brainwaves or heart rate. When they experience an anxiety spike, those activity levels jump, and they say, try and reduce those rather than stop being anxious, because you can't really do that. And it gives them something to focus on, gives them an external, tangible thing to grasp. The brain gives the brain something to grasp, and also other therapies doing that with the hallucinations in schizophrenia with avatar therapy, and PTSD is being treated in this way now. People are being exposed to scenes from their memory, and so on and so on. So that's something that sort of, in a roundabout way, I'm trying to do that with the book. I'm saying, yes, you may have these issues and problems, but here's what's happening in your brain when this occurs. Not necessarily your fault. It's not your responsibility. This is what's happening. Here's the physical basis for it. Here's what we think is going on. and why you're not flawed, you're just dealing with this thing right now. I think giving it a more tangible basis is something which, fingers crossed, can be reassuring, be more comforting, and help people understand it better and understand why certain therapies work and why medications work. And that is the goal, I guess.
Thanks so much to Dean for speaking to us. And thanks also to him for sticking with me as I experienced a number of technical challenges on the day. I would really recommend Psychological. I found it really interesting. It was a great listen in audiobook format. And I also found it really helpful at this time. If you're unfamiliar with COVID Aid, we are the UK's new national COVID-19 charity. We launched in May 2021, looking to support all those who've been affected by the pandemic. You can find out more about us at covidaidcharity.org. That is covidaidcharity.org. And you can also find us on all social channels by searching for COVID Aid Charity. We'll be back soon with another episode, and until then, take care.